Hello and welcome to the Soundstage Audiophile Podcast. In this second season of the show, host Jorden Guth is joined by a new guest each episode who knows something about hi-fi that Jorden doesn't. And who knows, while he's learning about all of this, you might learn something too. So with no further ado, here's Jorden and this week's guest.
Hello and welcome to the Soundstage Audiophile Podcast. Today we have Laurence Dickie with us. Laurence is an iconic designer in the hi-fi world, making some of the coolest looking speakers out there. Credits are numerous, patents are numerous. Laurence is the founder of Blast Loudspeakers, and he is the co-founder of Vivid Audio. And previously, he was working at B&W and led up the design of the Nautilus. So welcome, Laurence. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks very much. It's really good to be here. Thank you.
To get started, you do have like an absolutely incredible history, and it's so much fun to talk to you about all this stuff. Every time we meet in person, to just start, like, where did your journey to kind of lead you to where you are now? Where did this journey in audio and hi-fi begin? Was it your parents, or what was that?
Yeah, I mean, really, I blame the parents. My dad was very much into classical music, but also he appreciated the importance of being able to reproduce classical music in the home. He really loved listening to recorded music. And in fact, he used to be quite disparaging about UK audiences, because whether it's a function of the weather and climate, but UK audiences are quite noisy and disrespectful, and there's an awful lot of coughing going on. So he said, why should I pay to go and sit in a hall with people who are coughing and spluttering when I can have Leonard Bernstein in my front room in absolutely ideal circumstances? Yeah, that was something that he trotted out quite often. But anyway, yeah, the importance of reproduced sound was with me from birth, really. As I often say, I was born into a tannoy quad household. My dad had quad 2 valve amplifiers and a tannoy York corner loudspeaker. And it was absolutely... music reverberated through the house throughout my childhood.
And that kind of, I guess, led you through high school and then into college or university. Did you study acoustics in particular, or did you study something a little bit off to the side of that? Like,
And on the contrary, I was even more mainstream than that. I studied electronics. And in fact, in fairness, I was really into electronics. As a teenager, I was messing about in the bedroom with a soldering iron and lots of components. But loudspeakers were always there in the background. And whilst I might have been messing around with amplifiers, obviously, inevitably, at the end of the day, you have to stick the output of that amplifier into something. And loudspeakers were very, very important. And again, I'll refer back to my dad and his tannoys. Whilst they upgraded from the quads to actually Yamaha CA1000, if I remember rightly, in the later 70s, the loudspeakers remained a permanent fixture, and somehow there was due respect to the tannoys. And they only changed when I was able to offer him a pair of B&W 801s. And even then, it was grudging. I actually had to take him a pair and say, "Well, there you go, Dad. See what you think of those." I was up there for visiting for a weekend, and I hadn't warned him, and he was a little bit taken aback. And and I said, "Come on, let's move these tannoys." What? Move the tannoys? Anyway, eventually, I won him over, and he saw that actually it was a move forward.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, the 801s, I know there's an article about them right now, but they're just another set of iconic speakers.
Oh, absolutely. The particular 801, I should point out, is the 801 Series 2 Matrix. So that's the first of the reflex 801s. In every other respect, it shares the specification of the original, but it had a port in the front. And in my opinion, it was the best of the 801s. Actually, in my opinion, it was better than the later series of 801s, the Nautilus 801s. But that's obviously, as I will say on many occasions in a discussion like this, all a matter of taste. No one is wrong.
Oh, that's fair. That's fair. Now, those particular 801s, just out of curiosity, did you have any hand in designing or tweaking that particular series?
No. No, credit where it was due. It was definitely Steve Rowe, who was still the main engineer on that loudspeaker at that point. There was another young engineer who helped him, Mike Robinson. But no, it was Steve Rowe. And Steve Rowe, of course, who had been utterly fundamental to the design of the original 801 with its computer-optimized crossover. But my contribution, my contribution to that particular 801 was, of course, the Matrix. And I do sincerely believe that was an important contribution. But, it was an element with which Steve Rowe worked. And he was absolutely responsible for the overall balance and the design of the crossover, etc. Yeah.
There's a bit there, and we kind of glossed over it, how you got into BMW in the first place. So you were studying electronics in school. I seem to remember that you saw an ad in the newspaper for a position at BMW. You cut your hair because you thought it was so good. And then you went to actually, you got the job and went and worked at BMW. Is that correct? Or?
No, it's all correct. So I was a member of the Institute of Electrical Engineers, and in their monthly periodical, there was a tiny little advert. I mean, I'm not kidding. It was like 3 centimeters by 2. Acoustic engineer required, Bowers and Wilkins. And it was pretty much it, with a phone number. And but the point was that, I mean, as far as I was concerned, BMW were up there on a pedestal. It's not to say that I had actually, when I left university, I'd written to all the UK speaker makers, just on the never, hoping somebody might have a job, including Kef, of course. I actually went for an interview with Laurie Fincham, which was ever so interesting. He just assumed I must play bass. He said, "Surely all loudspeaker engineers play bass." He was a bit surprised. I was, at that time, a drummer. Anyway, but BMW, gosh, I've got a funny feeling they didn't even reply to my original my application. Anyway, so yeah, there was this little advert, and I happened to mention it to my dad, and he just said, "So, have you written to them yet?" I said, "No." I mean, really, it was like, "Well, I'm not worthy." And he said, "If you don't write the letter, I will." So that was the beginning, obviously. Now, the funny thing was, because it actually said in the advert, loudspeaker engineer, and I, as I've said, had a degree in electronics, but I was extremely interested in loudspeaker engineering. But I thought, now my actual acoustics theory is a little bit shaky. Now, any engineer you speak to will probably agree that engineering is a broad brush. But the particular flavor of engineering is just like, it's the icing on the cake, really. So all the equations are sort of common, whether it be acoustic, mechanical, electronic, they're all differential equations. But how you apply them, what those variables actually apply to, is the thing that changes. Anyway, so specifically, I knew my electronics, maths and theory, but I hadn't looked at an acoustic textbook seriously, although I did share a house with an acoustician, one Andrew Mackenzie, who was at the Institute of Sound and Vibration in Southampton. So I borrowed his textbook and duly swatted up for 2 weeks solid the works of Kinsler and Frey and Baranek. To any acoustic engineer will know those two.
Yeah.
And I got to this interview at BMW, And it said Steve Rowe. I was supposed to be talking to Steve Rowe, and I got there, and it was as if they'd forgotten it. I got in. Steve Rowe was actually underneath the PDP-11 mainframe computer. I say mainframe, it was just a rack-mounted computer.
Yeah.
It was literally underneath it, and sort of wheeled himself out from underneath. So, oh, hello, is it? Oh, yes, of course. Well, actually, we've got our acoustic engineer, and you can imagine my heart just plummeted. I said, but we looked at your CV, and we need an electronic engineer as well. So Glyn Adams will interview you. Glyn was head of research. Glyn Adams will interview you. But at that one stroke, all that reading about
acoustics just kind of vanished.
Volume velocities and whatnot just went out the window. But still, anyway, cut a long story short, Glyn offered me the job, and that was just the beginning of a most wonderful time.
Yeah, I remember you telling me bits of that, and I thought it was fascinating. It was like just the serendipity of everything to kind of get you there.
I mean, to be a little bit more specific about it, I think the thing which really clinched it was that I had been messing around, well, more than messing around by then. At the end of university, I started putting speakers together. I turned our shared student house into a workshop, or at least some of it. And I look back on those days and think how incredibly tolerant my flatmates were, or housemates. I just covered the place in sawdust. I mean, I'm covered in sawdust now. I do it all the time. So I built speakers, and then when I went to my first job, which was just an electronic engineer, actually for a games manufacturer, but it was just a job. But I was messing around with active loudspeakers. I'd found out about, I don't know, something had triggered it. I thought, active loudspeakers has to be the way forward, because quite clearly you can do the filtering operations much more accurately at signal level with op-amps and whatnot than at speaker level with inductors and capacitors. So I'd started developing an active speaker, and I have to say I was quite chuffed with the results. And I'd bought my first 20 sets of components to begin a small-scale manufacturing project when I saw the advert for the job at B&W.
Oh, no way.
And I have to say that I think B&W saved me from an awful lot of lessons of learning the hard way, I think, would have been it. Because honestly, in retrospect, I had no idea how to run a business. I've only got a little bit more now, but at the time, it would have been a catastrophic failure. But anyway, the important thing was when I went into that interview, I was able to say to Glyn, well, actually, I must have put it in my original application letter or something, but he said, so you've been working with active loudspeakers. And so I described what I'd done. And it turned out that was what they wanted. They had a perfectly successful little passive speaker, the DM1400 actually. And they had this idea of turning it active. Now, here was something I'd already been messing around with in the free time. So, yeah, it was a bit of an ideal match. And as far as I was concerned, what a brilliant first project. Develop the thing that I've just been doing at home. Yeah, great.
Oh, that's amazing. Now leading up, I think one of the things that you're most well known for is the Nautilus design. And then obviously the Vivids, the Gaias and the Kea and all of those. How did the Nautilus design originally come about? Was it that original project that kind of led into now let's make a flagship, or how did that start?
Okay, well, so as I did just refer above to the introduction of the matrix. Now, bear in mind that I was employed as an electronic engineer. That was in my job description. And indeed, it was all amplifiers and op-amps at that point. The speakers were a given. But I was always very interested in what the speaker people were doing. And the particular thing was the launch of the Celestion SL6000, which was in many ways just an ordinary two-way square box. But the important thing was that the cabinet was made of Aerolam, which is that aircraft grade honeycomb cord aluminium composite. And everybody at B&W was sort of soul searching. Why didn't we think of this? It's amazing, blah, blah, blah. And it happened that Glyn Adams, that was part of his work, was to come up with new cabinet wall materials. And he'd been going down the fairly conventional route of highly damped, stiff but damped sort of thing. But he hadn't thought of going for a lightweight composite, in fairness. Anyway, that was just unfortunate. So, meanwhile, I looked at this thing and thought, well, what would happen if you were to extend the core of the Aerolam walls right across the cabinet and effectively fill the cabinet with the core and just have the thin skins on the outside? Now, actually doing it with aluminium honeycomb would have been difficult because Ciba-Geigy only went up to, I think it was 6 inches. We could have probably had a go, but our cabinet, the speaker I would have looked at would have been 8 inches across at the time. Anyway, it sounds a bit made up, but it's actually quite true. I was in the tea room, and there was a wine box sat there, just an ordinary 12-bottle wine box. So it's got a 3x2 divider in it. I just looked at it. I thought, if we made that out of plywood and bored holes in it so the air could flow through, and stuck that inside a wooden box, what would happen? So I suggested it to Glyn. And in fact, I know what it's like when some young upstart comes along and starts telling you what to do. Now, that's not quite fair, but just, and he was a bit dismissive, frankly, but I don't blame him.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, bugger this, I'm going to make it myself. So I went down to the woodwork shop. We had a tiny little woodwork shop, and I managed to salvage a DM 1200 and cut the front out, made this lattice of wooden sheets, and completed this prototype and handed it to Glyn and said, there, what do you think of that? I have to say, it was really obvious. As soon as you tapped it, we always go on about the tap test, but you tap a cabinet with your knuckles and it's just immediately obvious what the cabinet's going to sound like. Anyway, I said, what do you think of this? And he was like, oh, well, that actually works, doesn't it? Anyway, so... so the rest is history. Is a bit obvious, but anyway, very kindly, I have to say, very kindly, because it wasn't part of my job description. I wasn't an electronic engineer. This was definitely a loudspeaker thing. They very kindly offered me a choice between a royalty on all Matrix cabinets or 3 months paid leave, and I chose the latter and took 3 months in India, which I will never forget. Absolutely. I mean, people say, oh, can you imagine if you'd taken a royalty on every Matrix cabinet? But you know what? That holiday was priceless. Absolutely amazing. So, it was a good decision. It was very kind of them. So, but the next phase was John Bowers saying, oh, well, that was a good idea. Have you got any others? I was going, oh, yeah. And so basically, I went over to his house and we spent an evening chatting about loudspeakers. And at the end of it, he said, well, I've got a bunch of work that I've been prototyping for some time. But basically, his thing was that he missed the sound of the electrostatic DM70. And he had this sort of quest to reproduce the sound of a DM70 using moving coil drivers. And the bee in his bonnet was that it was all about having the open back, the dipole. So that was where I started, really, was creating a cabinet-less loudspeaker, but in that particular case, it was a dipole cabinet-less loudspeaker. When I say cabinet-less, you know what I mean. The cabinet doesn't contribute to the sonic signature, so it doesn't resonate, it doesn't have diffraction effects, blah, blah, blah. And bit by bit, I realised that the dipole part of it was a bit of a red herring, that the important thing was getting rid of the cabinet. And having done that, the next absolutely most important thing was the driver itself. And the sad thing was, and I guess I'm kind of glad, but I'm afraid John had died by then. But the conclusion I came to was that Kevlar didn't actually sound very good.
Oh, interesting.
I don't know who had broken his heart. It wasn't actually his invention, but it would have been a bit galling. Anyway, Kevlar sounded like Kevlar, paper sounded like paper, plastic actually is the worst, sounded like plastic. With all these things, it's because it's breaking up in band. And the conclusion I came to was, do you know what? If we're going to produce a loudspeaker which truly sounds like an electrostatic, we have to get rid of all this breakup. And so at that point, I determined that we should really be looking at metal domes, which have very sharp but distinct and high frequency breakups. And as long as we could engineer those to be out of band, then we would be onto a good thing. So that was the beginning of the work that would end up with the Nautilus. But it was John who set me on the path of getting rid of the coloration in a loudspeaker. Obviously, terribly sad that he wasn't around to see where it led, but it was definitely, he gave me the nudge in the right direction.
That's fascinating. Now, I mean, the Nautilus is an iconic design, and a lot of your the Vivid Audio speakers also have. I'm gonna call it a very organic design. And one thing, this was quite some time ago. I think it was the first time I ever saw the Vivid. I think it was at like a CES, like in 2016 or something like that. And I filmed you and whatever. What I remember you saying is that it was along the lines of like form follows function. So you and to me that was kind of mind blowing, because I was thinking like these are art pieces that are then turned into speakers. But it sounds like it's actually by the way you describe it, it's actually the function of the speaker is what allowed the design to come out of it.
Absolutely.
Look, how did you come up with that function that led to that design, right? Like, it looks obviously the shell, but like, tell me about that a little bit. That's so cool.
Yeah, well, let me first of all say, I often open, when I give presentations at hi-fi shows and things, I often say, so many people have looked at Vivid Audio products, and they probably looked at the Nautilus the same, and said, well, there's an exercise in industrial design if ever I saw one.
Yeah.
And I have to, if I'm within earshot, correct, say, oh, excuse me, no, it's actually an exercise in engineering, and the industrial design follows to encapsulate the engineering principles. But it's very definitely an engineering-led product. And so, well, the thing that perhaps is most significant in terms of the design which results is the minimization of diffraction effects from sharp edges. So all the speakers I've had anything to do with in the hi-fi world for the last, since the Nautilus, it's the distinguishing thing is that there are no sharp edges. It's all smooth curves, and it's ever so distinct. If you put a driver in a flat plane with sharp corners or edges and measure the response, you can actually see the wiggles in the frequency. I mean, it's not, it's not subtle. There's a really big effect. And if you exchange that hard surface with sharp edges for a curved surface, either the side of a cylinder or the end of the hemisphere or something like that, it just goes away. The response becomes completely smooth. I'm not saying it's absolutely flat, because that's another question, but it's smooth. And so the anomalies that you have would be really easy to EQ with the crossover or whatever. It just becomes a lot easier to work with. And I should say, the wiggles associated with the sharp edges aren't easily EQ'd away. Well, you might be able to EQ it in one position, but they'll rear their ugly heads in some other position. So you really are better off sorting it out at source. You use a curvy cabinet, the problems go away. I mean, the only reason people use flat panel cabinets is obviously economics. It's much cheaper to make boxes out of sheet material than it is to mold them. Or certainly traditionally has been. So that's the dominant reason. But I mean, you only have to look at textbooks like Olson's, but that's like 1940 or something, where he clearly demonstrates the benefits of curved surfaces instead of straight edges or flat surfaces and straight edges. So there's nothing new.
Nothing new, but a lot of people still don't do that today, right?
I know. Economics there. No, hang on. That's not quite fair. Economics and conservative tastes in design.
That's fair.
I mean, the number of times, even my good old dad said, "Why can't you put those drivers in a nice wooden box?" I mean, you're missing the point, Dad. No, really, it's remarkable how conservative people are, particularly again in the UK. Gaining traction in the UK has been tremendously challenging, but it was the same for BMW. Actually, BMW placed great store in good design and hired the services of Kenneth Grange, really world-class designer, to do their designs really throughout the 70s. And the number of times they were the butt of jokes in the hi-fi press. The pregnant penguin was one of them, most famously. But they sold like hotcakes in Europe. It's so funny, the differences between the national tastes. Anyway.
That is kind of fascinating. And with that, we're going to take a quick little break, and we'll jump into some other questions about other tech that has similar organic designs after the break. Welcome back, everyone. Just before we took a break, we were talking about the organic shape of the speakers that you designed, Laurence. And one of the things that you showed me when we were at your facility was something called, I think it's the dendritic horn. Can you describe what that looks like and kind of its function and its purpose?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, it's in the name, dendritic. So it's tree-like. The funny thing is, when I tried to trademark dendritic, it was disallowed because it's too factually descriptive. It looks like a tree. So you can't have something that's apparently too literally descriptive. So the principle is quite simply that if you, and this is, I'll say now, it's a professional application rather than a strictly hi-fi one, but in the professional world, one of the key factors in loudspeaker design is pattern control, the dispersion of the sound, and not just the sort of on-axis frequency response. And one of the approaches which was thoroughly adopted in the 90s, beginning mostly with L'Acoustique, a French brand, was the line array. Now, in a line array, you have a tall, narrow source, which has a very wide lateral dispersion, but a very well-controlled vertical dispersion. Now, in the lows and mids, it's fairly easy. You can just literally have direct radiating drivers, and if you suspend a line of those, they behave as a line source. But when you get to high frequencies, where the wavelengths are smaller than the size of the cabinets, you actually have to take some measures to spread the sound so that it actually goes from the top to bottom of the cabinet with, more or less a vertical waveform. And the idea behind the dendritic horn was that we split the sound. So first of all, the sound is coming in from a compression driver. So it's already constrained into a tube, in effect, classically a 1-inch tube. That was a standard, a very popular American standard. And the big thing with the dendritic horn is you split it in two. Now, the good thing about splitting the sound in two is absolutely that the sound in the two channels is identical. And then you let that propagate a little further, and you flare it. It is a horn after all. And then you split it in two again, and the same applies. And in the particular model I think I showed you, I think it splits 4 times, because it's a 16 output, because you got 1 input and 16 outputs. But and the great thing is that it's designed so that the sound arrives all at the same time. So it's a pretty good approximation to a perfect linear source. So as a 1-inch entrance, but the exit is a 15 millimeter wide by I think 250 millimeter long slot. So it's got a really wide lateral dispersion, but if you put a bunch of them together in a line, it's got an incredibly narrow vertical dispersion. So actually it works really well. But the other thing, which was particularly pertinent to the first design in which we applied the dendritic horn, was that we wanted to put the tweeter, this compression driver, in front of the mid-range driver and have the sound coming out in phase with the sound of the mid-range. So we took advantage of the fact that the sound was already constrained to little channels, and by making the channels wiggle sideways quite sharply, really like hairpin bends on a mountain road, it means that you get extra distance in a short length. So actually the dendritic horn that you saw is probably only sort of 80 millimeters long, but the pathway is, about, I can't really remember, it's about 180 if I remember. So quite a bit longer. So it means that it makes for a compact loudspeaker with very useful acoustic qualities. But most importantly, because it's a really good idea to have a smooth path. Did I ever mention how important it is to not have
sharp edges? No sharp edges.
So in the dendritic horn, you have this thing which is not only splitting 2 by 2 by 2, but it's also going around these very curvy hairpins, and the whole thing ends up being, extremely organic. And I was really, really pleased with the way that thing turned out. It's one of those recurring themes in my work that I do like a thing to look good. And I absolutely understand that's always a matter of taste. But,
you like things that look good.
To me, yeah, absolutely. And I will go to a lot of trouble to make sure that it pleases me. It's one of the things I really admire is, and it can be a Hindu temple or a Victorian pumping station, is where people have taken endless care to add incredible detail in some place where hardly anyone is going to see it.
The expression that I think of with that is the carpenter that paints the back of a drawer. And and you'll never see that back of the drawer, but the carpenter still paints it because, or the woodworker, whatever finisher, whatever you want to call it. But the idea is that the pride in their work is so great that they want to make everything about it as detailed and perfect as possible for them.
I'm in complete admiration for people that do that sort of thing. Yeah.
Now, the dendritic horn. So after you showed that to me, I thought it looked so cool. It looked absolutely incredible. And then a little while later, I was browsing the internet and I was looking through some different stuff, and I found a picture of a beehive where the beekeepers did not put the separators between the individual compartments. So the bees were essentially left to make their own beehive in their own architectural desire and all that. And this beehive ended up looking strikingly similar to the dendritic horn that you showed. And in the description, basically what the researchers were talking about was the idea that they did these channels to allow smooth airflow to go through their entire hive. So this kind of reinforced for me this idea that in a lot of your designs, it looks like they're inspired by organic nature.
Right. It is interesting that you should say that. Nature is incredible, and we're constantly shown images or indeed find instances where nature just astonishes with its sheer elegance and beauty. And yes, it can be inspiring, but, people assume that some of my work is, as you say, inspired by nature. And I would say it's not quite that way around. I do what is most logical, with a physical challenge. And let's take a very simple example of, this program of engineering design has indicated that the best enclosure for this loudspeaker is to have a long tapered tube. What should we do with a long tapered tube? I know. How about we coil it up to minimize the amount of space that it takes? Oh my goodness, it looks like a snail. It's not inspired by snails or the cochlea in the air or anything. It's just the logical conclusion for what you do with a long tapered tube to minimize the amount of space that it takes up. And, there are a few examples of that sort of thing around. And it does fascinate me, the way that things can evolve in completely different parts of the world. From completely different evolutionary backgrounds or from evolutionary sources, like a mole in the UK and a burrowing mammal in the Sahara Desert. One's related to a deer and the other to an elephant or something. I don't remember. Yeah. But the interesting thing is the way they both come to the same conclusion, and they both have a particularly shaped upper arm bone. Is that called the ulna? I can't remember. So, as I was recently reminded, it's a thing called convergent evolution, isn't it? I would, of course, put a convergent design angle on it because the way it comes out for us is design. And yes, it's if you got, and actually, it is like convergent invention. It's like two people on different sides of the Atlantic come up with the idea of putting a filament inside of a bulb of glass at the same time, because all the background information is sort of appearing at the same time. So I think it's not surprising that this sort of thing does actually happen. Anyway, I think I digress.
Yeah. So, and that kind of leads me to this other thing where, with this design, with the different things that you do, a lot of different experimentation goes on. Going through your workshop, it's very evident that you are extremely hands-on. You like to get kind of in the nitty-gritty and kind of work through different stuff. Can you share a little bit about some of the projects or some of the experiments that you're working on right now?
No, absolutely. I mean, you're absolutely right that I'm very much a hands-on person. In fact, I go a little bit stir crazy. I spend too long behind my computer doing administrative things. I actually love doing CAD, computer-aided design. Yeah. I am actually very happy. For instance, designing a dendritic horn in CAD it's very satisfying, great fun. I don't play computer games. I've never really, apart from Grand Theft Auto once, I think I had a go.
That's a good computer game to start with.
Well, yeah. I probably had to go at Pac-Man about 30 years before it. But anyway, it was on both occasions probably good fun, but I'm not particularly motivated to do it. For me, designing a speaker on computer is a computer game. You've got a bunch of rules and you try and find a solution. And it's immensely satisfying. But doing it for real in the workshop, that is something which does make me feel very happy. I love turning bits of metal on the lathe. There's nothing like getting a precision fit between a cylindrical object and a corresponding hole. And of course, we prototype all our magnets, and there is quite a lot of that sort of machining to critical dimensions involved in that. But as I say, always very satisfying. Right now, I'm actually working. It's something that I've been toying with. Gosh, really, way back at my days at BMW, I remember bending Peter Fry's ear, saying we should really get into phased arrays and wave field synthesis. And somehow it it never seemed like it was going to be high-end audio at the time, and somehow B&W didn't ever get into it at the time. Anyway, finally, I've got it's actually an industrial application. It's not at all hi-fi, but I'm building a little phased array to do a small bit of Wakefield synthesis. But most importantly, I'm sticking together lots of bits of wood at the moment to make the thing. And even as I sit here, my hands are still sticky with the glue that I was just using. And yeah, it's tremendously satisfying. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing how that works. Now, there is an angle to this. Of course, Wakefield synthesis inevitably involves DSP, which that is something I've never really got to grips with, I regret to say. But thankfully, I do have an engineer working with me here who is right into that sort of thing, and together we shall crack this thing.
Now, there was a speaker, I don't remember which, I think it was a Gaia that I saw in your workshop that looked like it was being made of metal as opposed to yes. to the I'm forgetting the composite. Yeah, as opposed to the composite.
Yeah, composite, yeah. Yeah, that's like the Spitfire edition.
Yeah. Oh, it looks so cool.
Oh, do you know what, Jordan? I wish I'd finished that, but I know what I'm like. It's I started that little project specifically to make a display model for a Munich show. I won't say which year, but it wasn't last year. And I bought a sheet of, is it 1 millimeter? I think it's 1 millimeter, thoroughly annealed 1000 grade aluminium, which is so soft. It's wonderful. And I got a sheet of leather and probably a couple of pounds of lead shot. And so put the lead shot in the leather, wrapped it up, and used that as a mallet on a sandbag. And bit by bit, formed the aluminium to go around the loudspeaker. And as far as I got, I'm really happy with the look. But it took so much work. And the point was, I missed the deadline for submitting it to the Munich show that year. And it's such a monumental amount of work that's left to do. So as you go into the workshop, you see its good side, the finished side. Yeah. There's probably another 2/3 to go. Yeah.
Now, would that change the acoustic properties? Would that sound completely different? Nah, it's going to sound fairly similar?
I think it would be very similar. I should add one little point, is that whilst the main body of the loudspeaker was to be covered in that sort of aircraft look, formed aluminium with lots and lots of little screws holding it all in, the area around the mid and high frequencies where actually surface texture and things could have a bearing, that area, in fact, I was going to cover with red leather, and I even bought the red leather to do it, and that would be absolutely stuck firmly onto the surface and would be very inert, probably make absolutely no difference at all to the sound. And I thought, yeah, that would look pretty cool.
That was definitely a very cool looking little speaker. And another really cool looking speaker or speaker set that I saw there, you have a set of, I guess they were the drop test speakers. Is it the S12s? That's right. Were set up there. So these are not prototype speakers. They're production design speakers, but they were used for your drop test. And there was a really special cone. And can you describe this set of particular speakers? I think you know which ones I'm talking about.
Yeah, I do absolutely know which ones you're talking about. They are fairly unique. Although they don't have to be. The situation there was that, that little loudspeaker, the S12, went into production. Actually, here in the UK, it was an experiment, really, to see whether UK production would work. Sadly, our costs were just so much higher than those in South Africa that the production of S12 has now moved back to our main facility. But it was an interesting learning process. It also coincided, of course, with COVID. And along with COVID, there was, a shortage of many raw materials for lots of manufacturing industry. I mean, just everything shut down. In our particular case, the crucial material was 5056 aluminium foil. We could see we were facing a bit of a problem, to put it mildly. However, one pleasant summer's evening, I was taking a swig out of a can of, I think it was Kronenberg, might have been Stella, anyway, some fizzy lager of some sort. And as I finished it, and I noticed, not for the first time, the sort of the crispiness of the grade of aluminium. It did strike me that it sounded fairly similar to the 5056 alloy. I mean, when we get a piece of 100 micron foil off the reel, and if you crumple it, it has a particular sound. It's very different to sort of cooking foil, that sort of thing, which is dull in comparison. Because this stuff is strong, I think, it means that when it finally yields, when you crumple it, and it finally goes into nonlinear deformation, it does so rather sharply, and you end up with lots of high frequencies. So it has a characteristic sound. It struck me that this beer can had that same characteristic sound. Oh, I wonder how thick it is. Oh my goodness, it's 100 microns. This is exactly the same as our speaker cones. Well, it was quite obvious that the next step was to cut the top and bottom off one of these cans and unroll it and stick it in the press. And, you know, the cone itself actually formed pretty well. The dome not quite so well, but do you know what? The difference is utterly negligible. And it has to be said that the finished result is not far at all from the the response of the Bonafide 5056 model. So it was born out of potential necessity, but in the end, it was done with tongue in cheek and smile on face. But yeah, you're right. We use it every day, and it does actually work very well.
Yeah, they're an amazing set of speakers. I mentioned it in previous episodes, and when I talk to people, those are definitely the nicest set of speakers that I've ever listened to Slayer on. And I love Slayer. I love heavy metal and all of that. And those speakers, I mean, they just sound absolutely great.
Ah, cool. Well, as you pointed out, those are our workshop speakers, and it's very common to have music on a workplace. And our man, Matt Joy, loves his music. And as you yourself saw, he has a huge range of music, from really thrashy new wave, things like Clash and American bands like Cramps and stuff like that. And he's always reminding me of excellent music from the past. And the great thing is that we might well be a manufacturer of fine-sounding high-end loudspeakers, but we never forget that what it is actually about is the music. And Matt is completely devoid of audio snobbery. He listens to music, unquestionably. He appreciates good sound, but most importantly, he listens to music. So it's great fun having him in the workshop. He's always putting stuff on, and more often than not, reminding me of how good stuff that I haven't heard for a while is, but also introducing me to stuff that I'd never actually heard of. But yeah, we have themed days sometimes. And just a couple of days ago, it was a Led Zeppelin themed day, and we listened to Physical Graffiti all the way through. I'd forgotten what an excellent album that was. It is actually pretty well recorded as well. And I knew so many of the words and so much of the music just intimately. I'd forgotten how much I must have listened to that album when I was a kid. Yeah, amazing. Anyway.
Yeah, definitely a great set of tracks on that. Yeah. Just kind of thinking actually back to those S12s and then all of your other speakers. These speakers are all passive. They all had different components plugged into them. And
yes,
what's interesting to me is when I think about the Nautilus was active, if I'm correct.
Absolutely.
So can you tell me a little bit about maybe your thoughts or kind of considerations in why you decided to go from active to passive, or if there's a preference one way or another, or kind of talk to me a little bit about that decision in your mind.
Yeah, I'll try and condense the history into as short a time as possible. But basically, I started building speakers when I was a teenager, actually. But after I finished my university course, I started building speakers based on KEF drivers using the off-the-shelf crossovers that came from the DIY supplier. I don't think they're even made by KEF. They're some other company that did it. And I know that, well, I know now that they're not particularly accurately made. I'm not sure that I did then. But I could see from the quality of the components that were being used and from the responses that were being published. I wasn't actually able to measure it myself, but I could see the responses weren't particularly great. And I thought adding EQ to these would be so much easier to do at line level. And so my interest in active speakers was born. And I ended up making a pretty simple two-way active speaker based on the good old LS358, so it's a KEF B110 and T27, two amplifiers with discrete components. And I thought it was a pretty good result. And funny enough, that was probably what got me my job at B&W, because when I was interviewed, it turned out that they were interested in starting or designing a new active speaker. So when in the interview I said I'd been doing this as a hobby, they were pretty taken by that. And so I got the job, and indeed my first project was to create the Active One, which is basically an active DM1400. I kind of never looked back from that point whilst at B&W. As far as I was concerned, if you want to do the job accurately, do it actively. So when we started the Nautilus, there just wasn't any question it was going to be active. Oh. I was also able to do a thing in the filter system. It's based on a paper by Lipschitz and van der Kooi, and it's sort of linear phase. Basically, you subtract a all-pass filter from a Bessel low-pass filter, and you get the high-pass. And by definition, when you add the two things together, you get an all-pass response. So it's kind of linear phase. Anyway, too much detail. I had no inclination to get involved in passives at that point. And when I looked at my fellow engineers at B&W, messing around with coils and capacitors and literally doing it by trial and error as far as I could see, because although they had been done some landmark research on developing the 801 back in the 70s using computer modeling on a day-to-day basis, it actually wasn't really that practical. So in the end, you learn a few rules of thumb designing passive crossovers, and then after that, trial and error. Yeah. Anyway, that was most unsatisfactory as far as I was concerned. When I joined Philip Guttentag and Bruce in South Africa to start the Vivid Audio project and came to them, I actually had a design that I'd created in that couple of years after B&W, and showed them this design, and just almost as a throwaway said, well, it's active, of course. And Philip was just like, oh, no, hang on. Now, Philip was in the, both of them had been in the retail hi-fi business. And both of them knew that if you had an active-only option, a funny-shaped speaker coming from a country with no reputation for making audio, you might as well burn the money and go fishing. It's just a waste of time. So Bruce had heard about some crossover network analysis software. And so we bought a copy of this thing. And honestly, it absolutely transformed my opinion of passive crossover design. Now, it has to be said that for passive crossovers to work, it really helps to have well-behaved drive units. So, we pride ourselves with doing exactly that. We've put so much effort into creating well-behaved drive units. And that, when I say that, I mean the drive unit in the cabinet with the rear loading and all the rest of it. That actually it makes passive crossover really very accurate. That's the thing, because you're not compensating for all sorts of sharp wiggles in the frequency response. So everything is basically smooth. And that really just turned my opinion around, because in fact I could see that you could get responses that were easily within half a dB of your target. I mean, really very good. let's not forget the computer optimization isn't clever. It's actually quite dumb. All it does is it changes it in fact does exactly what we were doing at BMW. It's trial and error. Is it better? Is it worse? If it's better, well, do it again. Is it better? Oh, do it again. Oh no, it's worse. Right, go back.
It's like the eye test when it's like, is it clear? Okay.
Exactly. So, and it goes round and round the loop, doing it over and over. But of course, it's a computer, so it does 5 million of them in 0.1 seconds. Yeah. So that is that does work very well. Anyway, nevertheless, in the back of our minds, we thought, active clearly, ultimately is the better way. And it's about 10 years ago now, we teamed up with some Scandinavian chaps, Swedish chaps, who had a really powerful DSP engine, we call it, 2 in, 8 out, with a whole measurement system built in. We did quite a few sort of straight through experiments to, basically with no frequency response shaping or anything, just to listen to the D2A8D. And that was very convincing. And then we modeled the crossover using their software. And actually, there was no question the passive was better. So then, not wanting to give up immediately, then I just went through the rigmarole of really accurately mimicking the response of passive crossovers using the minimum phase active crossovers. I mean, within a quarter of a dB, it was really spot on. And the interesting thing was that then when we did a blind test, no one could tell the difference. There really was no statistically significant difference between the passive and the active. And at that point, I just said to Philip, do you know what? The only people to make money out of this are the amplifier makers, and we don't make amplifiers. I suggest we stop now. So that was it. That was the closest that we at Vivid got to doing active speakers. It's not to say that we don't appreciate that some people will want to tinker, if that's a polite way of putting it. They're free to. There are, it's like Trinoff is one system, or WLA is another, where you have the freedom to put in filter functions in the DSP, and indeed we worked with both companies to produce active systems. Oh, and there was one chap who supplied a pair of G2s to replace his old Lin isobarics. He had a stack of name power amps, and he didn't want to lose those. So I designed remodeled the name active filter to work with our G2s, and he was really happy and still very, very happy. So
there is a bespoke pair of G2s out there that is technically active. That is active. It doesn't.
It is. Yeah. It is. Yeah. It actually. The chap's interested in upgrading to another model. So if there was somebody out there that wanted them, contact me.
Oh, interesting. There you go. Oh, that is awesome. You could have a one-of-a-kind bespoke set of Laurence Dickie designs, active G2s.
To carry on the active tip. So actually, there are very few purely active high-end loudspeakers. Maybe it's because in the stratospheric, thin regions of the ultra high end, people want to have the freedom to tinker and to have it. When we did the Nautilus, I wanted to just, it's on a concrete base to balance the thing, because actually it's terribly chin heavy. So the concrete base keeps it on the ground. And I wanted to actually make that concrete base out of a sandcast aluminium block, sandcast and then machine, with a hollow underside with 4 amplifiers and the active electronics built into the bottom. But quite rightly, in retrospect, again, BMW have no reputation for electronics. People would want to be able to use their own amplifiers. It was never going to fly. But yeah, largely speaking, self-contained, active, and top high end just don't mix. But towards the bottom end of the scale, yes, okay, there are a growing number of fully self-contained active loudspeakers. I'm looking at a WLA Phantom at the moment, actually. Yeah, very respectable. The problem I have with them is actually environmental. You buy a loudspeaker with a bunch of electronics in it, which may become obsolete or may fail, but one way or another, I think that statistically, the loudspeaker part of it is going to survive the electronics part of it. And it pains me to think of all these active speakers that will, more often than not, end up in landfill when the loudspeaker part of it could quite happily carry on for another 50, 100 years, So whilst we did toy, because inevitably people say, oh, when are you going to produce a Bluetooth S12 or something?
Yeah.
I say, no, please, rather buy a Bluetooth power amplifier and stick it into your S12s. Because you know what, when there's a new standard of Bluetooth or some other, it could be
AirPlay or Android, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. You just change that little block of electronics, but you can keep the loudspeakers. So, yeah, I've definitely moved away from that. I understand there's a sort of, it's so plug and play. You just plug and play. But hey, the only difference between having a power amp block with two wires and a power lead, as opposed to just two power leads, is, it's one wire difference. So honestly, people, I think that I was very encouraged when I saw that Sonos had produced a little block like that. And of course, again, the original WLA, very highly interconnected. Very, very useful piece of kit.
Yeah.
So that's it. Now, I don't think you're going to see Bluetooth or self-contained active speakers from Vivid Audio.
I like the idea that even somebody of your knowledge and experience and all of that can have their opinion changed, because it's really neat to see that you can go from active is the way to being convinced and saying, you know what, maybe passive is better in these situations, to being like, you know what, passive for me, for what we're doing, is the way that we're going to continue. So I think that's awesome.
I think it is important to, is always important to try and keep an open mind if possible.
I fully agree. I fully support that. I don't want to take up too much more of your time. There is a question that we want to ask every guest that comes on the show, and you already kind of hinted at it when you were talking about in your workshop and kind of Matt, who works there, who's awesome, and his musical taste and all of that. What would you say the soundtrack to your life is? What music do you listen to on the day-to-day basis that that kind of resonates with you or gets you going?
I enjoy a very broad spectrum of music. There used to be, probably still is, a station on French radio, France Musique, and there's also FIP, which is a Paris-based station. The thing about those two stations is they play continuous music with, I think, just a station announce every hour or so. But otherwise, it's just continuous music. And what really impressed me as a teenager was the way that you'd have a Beethoven Sonata 1 second and then Pink Floyd the next. So yeah, that dates it actually. That would have been 1973. Actually, yes, it was 1973, wasn't it? Dark Side of the Moon. And it really impressed me because my dad, did I mention my dad?
Yeah.
Who had a very important influence over my musical upbringing and the whole of my interest in reproduced sound. But he was strictly classical. He would just about allow jazz simply because he could see that these were talented people playing real musical instruments. But anything amplified was just out the window. Anyway, so I'd been brought up in this very sort of purely classical household, and to have a radio station where they were playing, as I say, Floyd next to Beethoven really impressed me. Anyway, yes, I listen to and enjoy a large range of music. I still do love classical music, Beethoven, Chopin, piano, really. I think it's a bit of a cliche that loudspeaker people have a bit of a love affair with organ music because, of course, a big old pipe organ has low frequencies to die for. And it's every speaker designer's dream to be able to reproduce the sound of a 64 foot. Yeah. They're quite unusual. Certainly a 32. But yeah, so that was my sort of formative years. And then I got into prog rock, Frank Zappa, Led Zeppelin, of course. Thinking about it, it was all quite rocky in the 70s. And then and some of those guys, and then I got into Gong, who were a bit more psychedelic. And then there was one of their guys, Steve Hillage, who took the psychedelia thing and sort of put a bit of a driving dance rhythm to it, which at the time I was never much of a dancer as a teenager, but hey, this guy, Steve Hillage, came on stage and then suddenly I was up and dancing. I was like, wow. And Steve Hillage went on to produce lots of electronic dance music about a band called System 7. And so, my musical evolution went along with that. And then by the time the 90s came along, it was all out raves and dance music. And in fact, again, a crossover between the loudspeakers and musical taste. We built a sound system, a rig out of BMW drivers, actually, and took this thing into old warehouses and around the countryside and had some blistering parties, where we danced all night long to rave music. But, my love of Chopin, all the rest hasn't changed or diminished. It's I think your musical taste just grows, doesn't it, with age? It's rather wonderful. And my kids are introduced into all sorts of stuff. Arctic Monkeys. Yeah. I should say my wife as well, who's got wonderful musical taste and stuff that I sort of took for granted at the time. Stevie Wonder, David Bowie, stuff like that, which now I really appreciate the excellence of their music. But on the other hand, I've introduced her to Miles Davis and people like that. So yeah, it's a fair exchange. Otherwise, what else am I into? I'll tell you, I went to see about 8 months ago a band called Pussy Riot. Okay. Who they're a bunch of Moscow-based punk ladies who infuriate Vladimir Putin. So you can't say more.
I love it. I love it.
But Iggy Pop, Blondie, Cramps, these are all people that my wife loves, and so yeah.
That's awesome. You're giving me
quite a lot of music.
Yeah, that's amazing. You're giving me quite a lot. I'm literally writing these down as we go, and I'm going to be adding them to my playlist to kind of get a sense of.
Bottega. Is it Bottega? Who actually we saw them in Brighton. I live in Brighton. Brighton's an excellent place. We constantly see all sorts of new bands, new music. Yeah, Bottega. They're quite audacious. I hope I've got the name right. Yeah. We've got an album where they sing each track in a different language.
Oh wow.
That's quite a skill.
That's incredible. That's absolutely unreal. Yeah. Okay, I'm looking those guys up as well. Laurence, thank you so much for all the time you've spent with us. I greatly appreciate it. Just in closing, is there any place that if somebody's looking to kind of either hear more about some of the stuff that you've done or look into the stuff that you're currently producing, where would you like to send people?
I mean, really, if you want to talk about Vivid Audio specifically, then info at Vivid Audio will, if relevant, the inquiry will get through to me. I think that's probably the safest thing. As I say, we do. We actually have a consultancy company here where I do work for, not just domestic audience, but I think let's leave that input channel to just info at Vivid Speakers, and it'll get through to me. Yeah, I'm always. In fact, I'm too prepared to bang on for ages to anyone who'll listen about loudspeakers, and if that person happens to be in the UK and they fancy going for a beer, then I'm even more likely to do it.
I love it.
I talk about loudspeakers all night.
Oh, I love it. Well, with that, I will say that the next time we're back in London, I'm sure, or in England, I should say, I'm sure we'll be we'll ringing you up and go hang out at a pub again and enjoy a pint. Thank you so much, Laurence. All the best.
Okay, John. Absolute pleasure. Great. See you soon.